the sustainability transformations. So in practice, the program goes like this, that first we have 3 speakers, one from each institute, and each speaker has some 10 to 15 minutes for presentations, and then there's space for a few questions, depending on the actual length of the talk. So please feel free to ask questions. You can propose questions in the chat, and Pia Kolari, who is our technical assistant today, she will keep an eye on the chat and make sure that those get picked up. But you can also put up your hand or even like yell through your microphone to make sure you get heard, because when multitasking with the teams, we might just not pay enough attention to your hand up or something like that. So the whole seminar will take approximately an hour. And it will be recorded from now on until 4 o'clock. Because we will then provide all these seminar series on our web pages, and they will be available there for educational purposes and interested people. But once the actual seminar presentations are over, we stop the recording, and then there is still time, half an hour, for free discussion. This used to take place face-to-face in Viikki, around a coffee table. But now, since 2 years, we have been running this virtually. But we hope we can still keep the kind of relaxed atmosphere and bring up whatever ideas come up based on today's presentations or the overall topic. So our first speaker today is Minna Kaljonen. She's a research professor at the Finnish Environment Institute, SYKE, and her title today is How to Think About Policy Mixes for Just Sustainability Transition. So Minna, please, not the floor, but the window is yours.
The screen.
Screen.
Thanks a lot, Susanna, and hello all, and greetings from Viikki. I am actually in Viikki at the moment to give justice for the seminar as well. So I come from the Finnish Environment Institute, and as Susanna told, so I act here as a research professor for sustainability transitions or even just transitions. And today I thought about that I will think a bit with you about policy mixes for sustainability transitions or even for just transitions. Can you see the slides? Just checking if someone can. Yes, thanks a lot. So actually a bit of a background of me. So I have been studying the kind of environmental governance and policy for quite some time now. And for maybe because of the thing that I just have come to love agriculture and food, so many of my studies have concentrated on agriculture and food. And here is a picture of me like maybe 20 years back, where I am on a field site thinking about how the at that time, the so-called agri-environmental policies, how they encourage farmers to biodiversity management. And we are evaluating there the biodiversity of this particular field site. But nowadays, I have turned more and more towards this kind of a system thinking in system transition and transformation, and come to think that actually, like also for the kind of a policy studies, that we need and require more and more these kind of a conceptual tools and analytical lenses on how to think in a systemic manner. And this is something that I'd like to now discuss with you today. Before going there, I don't know if you noticed that last weekend the Green League had a party meeting in Joensuu. and they had this one proposal in the coming party program, which argued to pay compensation for the low-income people in the rural areas on their rising fuel and energy costs. And if you think about this, so when I first heard this, I felt that, like, is this now really that the Greens are trying to get more voters for themselves, or what is going on here? If you keep this question with you as we go through the presentation, so we can maybe discuss a bit that in the end, towards the end, that what is going on here with the Green Party or the Green League as well in terms of environmental policy and governance. So today, this is kind of the argument or the outline of my talk today is that I shall first think a bit that why we should think in a more system-oriented manner about environmental policy and governance, and then I will show and think a bit that what kind of frameworks and concepts the current sustainability transition studies can offer for us in doing that, and then think a bit further with this notion of a just transition, that what does it really mean and how it might even widen the system perspective even more. And I will argue also that it actually does not only widen, but it really politicizes the sustainability transition once and for all, I would say, in that way. And I will draw some examples from the food system transition, from the studies that we are carrying out at the moment. This was in 21. The one of the leading journals of environmental policy and political studies, Environmental Politics, published this kind of an anniversary special issue where they went through the kind of the state of the art in environmental politics, or the study of environmental politics. And it's a good special issue to go to and have a look at that. What are the kind of things that are brought up there as a kind of how the study of environmental politics, how it has become as it is, and what should be done in the future. And I took here two of the papers, which both argue for quite big paradigm shift in the environmental policy studies. The first with Frank Biermann really argues about this, saying that we cannot only look at the soul, that if we are only looking at the kind of conventional environmental policy, it's all too narrow to concentrate solely on the environment, because it's kind of cuts out the society in the environmental policy, and it's kind of if we only look at it from a very kind of a singular point of view of policies, and Frank Biermann is arguing more for this kind of a socio-ecological approaches and for environmental justice and so forth, talking in a very big manner, so to say, but arguing for a paradigm shift, saying that it's not enough anymore to environmental policy to concentrate on singular policies. The Robin Eckersley thinks then further that what is the role of the state in a sustainability transition or transformation, and takes also a quite critical view on the sustainability transition studies, and argues a bit of a more kind of how to say, pluralistic and political understanding of a societal transformation, meaning that they cannot be all guided by the state, but it's important that we kind of look carefully at what is the role of the state in the current transitions or transformations that our societies are going through, meaning that they may be chaotic, meaning that they are open and not totally kind of cannot be totally dictated, but thinking about that there is a need to rethink the role of the state there. A couple of these kind of frameworks that are now under quite intensive development in the sustainability transition studies from the perspective of policy and governance. And this is really this kind of an X curve that was already introduced quite some time ago. But this is kind of going further and further. People are thinking about what are the kind of policies, and be they private or public or driven by third sector or so forth, that what are kind of how we can enable the transition. And the key message there is that the green arrow is for kind of accelerating enabling the innovations to break through, but then the red line is more about phasing out and disrupting the kind of a current unsustainable production and consumption practices and the kind of a systems, the modes of doing. So that meaning really the message here is that you cannot do either or, but you need to think in both. And when we look at the red curve, so then also this kind of when the regime, that the current practices that the current normative practices that we are carrying out here and there, and especially in economic sectors, that we also need to take into account the kind of the harmful effects in a way that the transition may have on individual persons or certain economies or so forth, and the policies are needed there as well to help people and these certain businesses to go through the transition. And now this kind of the lower curve of the red one, this is perhaps something that most commonly in transition studies is something that is called attention to just transition. That what could it then entail? There in the middle, on the lower part of the screen, there are some examples of the kind of policy instruments that are kind of essential in different phases of the transition. Meaning again here that it's really this kind of thinking in policy mixes, that it's not only one singular policy that can solve the thing, but rather we need to understand how they play together and for what when going further. This is one step further from the X curve, I would say, thinking really about the policy intervention points in the transition. And there again, the first two are for the kind of this innovation stimulation and acceleration. This is then the green curve, and then comes this regime destabilization, and then taking care of the kind of repercussions of the destabilization, thinking about what does it really mean in practice, in policy practice, what can take place there. But then also highlighting that this kind of all this needs coordination and multi-level governance, I would say here, or multi-sector governance. And this is perhaps something that it's the most difficult thing in our current societies to really work for. And then in the sustainability transition studies, there is this concept of landscape, which is then about something bigger happening in our kind of in society values, or even environmental catastrophes or war or whatever, and how this then affects upon the things that what are happening, how the change is going on within the regime. And this is kind of actually quite nice paper, because it's a review paper, and it again tries to identify concrete policies for these exact intervention points, and think about that what role the different policies have to play there. And as I hinted, so now the just transition thinking and theorizing is going on intensively, both in political spheres, but also in research. And they go a bit of a different path at the moment. And my argument is that we actually would, we desperately need some kind of a middle level concepts to bring this together into policy and political practice, to understand that what does this just transition really mean. So just a few words about the origin of the concept. So in political sphere, It is actually a concept that is more invented by the labor unions. So it's very important to understand that, and that is the kind of it's one of the reasons behind of its interpretation, meaning that the climate policies should take also into account the social and economic consequences of the actions to the work, to the employment, and to the specific regions or to the economic sectors and so forth. So, for example, the fossil or the coal industry, for example, which has been kind of concentrated also on a regional level. So how to mitigate those and help with policy to create new jobs and new regional well-being, and education policies are important there as well. But as we all know, so that the climate policies both on the EU level, but also in Finland, they have taken on board this thinking in just transition with the slogan of leave no one behind. And also in Finland, the SYKE labor unions are... Sorry.
2 minutes max left.
Oh, sorry. Oh, then I need to rush. This happens to me all the time. But then from the theoretical point of view, the just transition and the justice in transition is much, much deeper and goes much also longer in history. So there is this long tradition of environmental justice scholarship. And in philosophy, it's a very critical concept that kind of gives critical lenses to the inequalities at present, or in this environmental justice thinking about what are the kind of how certain groups or people or communities that are impacted by the environmental problems in a very unequal manner. And there is a lots of philosophical thinking around the kind of how to think in justice and what does it really mean. That it's not only this kind of a distribution of benefits and harms, but it's really about a procedural question, how can people can have a say on their issues and how they can be taken on board in making the political decisions. But then also about this kind of a recognitive justice in the plurality in our societies, how to give recognition to this. And then I would maybe underline this capabilities approach, that how can we kind of support the capabilities of different individuals, but also groups to live up with the transition and go with the societal change. But this is kind of there is now at the moment, there lacks this middle in between, that how do we kind of understand what kind of a political interpretation the just transition gets, and what does it mean politically and in a policy context. And at the moment we are examining this particular question in terms of in food system transition. And I'm at the moment we are carrying out this very large project on just food system transition, where we are looking at the just food system transition from different perspective. And one of the things that we are doing there is that we are having this kind of a policy dialogue on what does the just transition mean in this context, and how do the different stakeholders interpret the just transition. And we have gone through this quite extensive dialogues with the stakeholders. And I was about to say the key issues that are now arriving from these discussions, we are now just analyzing them. And there are some critical things arising from there, is that at the moment the just transition is interpreted from a quite narrow perspective, mostly as a kind of a foreseen harm caused by an individual policy instrument, so to say. It's very hard to kind of broaden the thinking into more kind of into more bigger thing, or into a wider perspective on policy mixes. And then another thing which is also very important, and I'm very critical, and this comes from the kind of a critical reading of justice, is that it is very much entangled with the existing injustices. at the moment, and there exist a lot of these in the food system at the moment. For example, the position of farmers in the food chain, and their kind of quite big profitability problems and so forth. So many of the climate actions also seem unjust of the existing injustices that are now there in place. So when all this comes together, there becomes a kind of a particular understanding of a just transition where the individual climate measures appear unjust. And now I understand that I have time, so I won't go to the details in here, but we have kind of gone through the different pathways that what are the kind of justice questions or worries that come from there. And the key messages I put up already there are individual messages which go back to the policy intervention points that I showed you earlier. And this is kind of my attempt to come to this kind of middle level into thinking about just transition meaning in policy practice. Just to go on this, that the theme decarbonization is very difficult because it's deeply entangled with current injustices, and this is kind of contradictory in a way because if the current regime is unjust, you should fix it somehow. But it's kind of, you can't go, at the moment it's very hard to go forward with thinking because of the current deep injustice, so to say. It's very hard to think about the extent politics.
We should close quite soon.
Yes, I will wrap up. But one thing that arises from our discussions is the capabilities approach and the capacity building, which is kind of highlighted there as one measure for just transition. And then also I would maybe then highlight this landscape build there. The last one is that in our discussion, which took place before the current situation in UK, so it was not as actively asked for, but as we have seen that the instability increases and this puts the pressure on the region in destabilization, I think. So that kind of highlighting again that really the time to think about the just transition. My take-home messages here is really that actually the just transition turns sustainability transition political. It kind of shows how political it all is, that it's not simply a question of compensation, but rather that what kind of a social change the state should steer. And here, in the political sphere, this really means that we need to widen our political imaginaries about the just transition, that what can it entail, that it's not only about compensating the fuel prices to people, but what does it really mean, this transition in the regime, how we can kind of de-radicalize the current unsustainable practices. And then for the research, the take-home message is really that this kind of a middle-level concepts are really much now needed, and we need to operationalize the great justice concepts in political studies and understand the political nature of justice here in the transition. And this goes for comparative studies between the different dynamics in the different sectors, for example, and food. Then also studies novel procedures in policy, but also the conventional ones. And I myself have started to very much kind of long for the very conventional political studies in this case.
Yeah,
like,
now
for
we really
example,
have to stop because I
see
the time from other speakers. Thank you. A very interesting talk, and I'm sure we could have spent a full hour on this topic alone. So thank you for this, and now we move directly.
Yes.
Directly onto Janne, and we will have questions for this one then at the end. But now, so our second speaker is from HELSUS, Professor of Environmental Policy at the University of Helsinki, Janne Hukkinen. And his title today is Strategic Environmental Crisis Management, One Technical Issue. Towards the end of the previous talk by Minna, I had a slightly failing network connection. Is everybody else hearing good?
It was same for me.
Yeah, I had issues as well.
Okay, so let's see how Janne this functions technically, and if it doesn't, then Tia, we should check if there's anything we can do to it if it continues failing.
Yes, if it continues failing, maybe then the video could be closed and only
The speaker's video.
Yeah, only have the speaker on.
Yeah. Then you can perhaps just turn it off if you, without interrupting Janne, if you see that there's connection doesn't work. Okay, thank you. So please, Janne, the screen is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, at least for now.
Okay. So my talk is about strategic environmental crisis management. And I'll start out with a hypothetical. The quotes are real, but the interaction is hypothetical. It could have happened. And my question is this a dilemma? Greta Thunberg has been talking to high-level politicians, and this is one direct quote from her talks. You say, and this is talking to the politicians, you say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil. How dare you? In other words, how dare you not act? And the former head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, has once said in an interview, we all know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. And it's an interesting dilemma, and I've thought about it a lot, and I've actually taken it up as a serious research question. And I've been running for the past almost 5 years now, 2 large research consortia focusing on strategic environmental crisis management. The WISE project is a strategic research council project, creative adaptation to wicked socio-environmental disruptions. Long risk is entitled Decision Support to manage the long-term growth of environmental induced multi-hazard risks in urban areas. So it's the same theme, but the long risk is focusing on urban areas. The objective is to develop strategic crisis management at the broadest level. In other words, how to make coordinated decisions during an environmental urgency that are sensitive to long-term bad dependencies. In other words, it's pretty much the Greta Thunberg question to politicians converted into a research question. I mean, the reality today is that we are living, we have entered an era of chronic social and ecological crisis. And the challenge is to deal with the crisis and at the same time deal with them in a way that takes into account the long-term, the decadal bad dependencies. Now the concrete outcome, to be really concrete, it has at least 2 names that we have used in our project: strategic situation room or a policy operations room, which is really a platform for strategic crisis decisions. And we've experimented with this idea of a strategic situation room in Finnish cities, and we continue doing those experiments, particularly this year. And I've listed the research partners there. What is the strategic situation room? This is a visual presentation. You have some kind of, within that situation room, you have policymakers and some kinds of risk or uncertainty experts. They can be city administrators, city experts. And then we, the researchers, observing what's going on. And then there's a dashboard that displays one way or another scenarios of the future, of what these chronic crises might look like. And those scenarios are presented in a way that reflects some kind of common conceptual framework. And that's kind of the situation room. That's where you try to tackle make urgent decisions, and at the same time tackle very long-term sustainability challenges. Now, the conceptual framework, we divide them conceptually into 3 different kinds of situation rooms. We don't have to worry about the titles, but we've experimented, first of all, in Kotka with this base bore, where you sort of reveal all the possible causal scenarios into the future, and the experts can consider those. Or you can have this so-called path bore, which we experimented with in Helsinki in 2019, where the experts can make decisions, but they can only make one decision, and then they are taken to the future on the basis of the decision that they made, and then sort of the path goes on. And then obviously there's the existing preparedness exercise, which is sort of a crisis board where you have a crisis event and experts need to react to that. Let's look at the Helsinki Policy Operations Room, sort of the so-called path board, first of all. It flowed like this. At the top you see, this isn't finished, but we showed them a situational video from the situation today. They are given 3 different decision options that takes them to the year 2030, and again they can, based on the decision that they took, they can then choose again from alternatives, which then takes them to the year 2040. So that's one way of organizing a path, that they make choices, and that's the choices guide them to the future. Another possibility, which we experimented with in Kotka, is more or less this, what I showed earlier, the top one, where you see all the choices, the base board. So the idea there is that there's some kind of chronic crisis event that has causal implications for the existing strategies that the city of Kotka has. And the purpose of the situation room exercise is to articulate the pathways through which the particular kind of chronic crisis could threaten the city strategies. We've developed these further on, and we just had an exercise with the city of Helsinki again, where we've taken the Kotka ideas further by analyzing the various sectoral strategies of the city of Helsinki. Those you can see on the outer circle. On the inner ring, you can see the chronic climate-induced crisis. And what we did was that we analyzed the tensions or the conflicts between different strategic goals. In other words, if the city takes certain types of measures to counter a particular kind of chronic environmental crisis, it may achieve the strategic goals of one sector, but violate the strategic goals of another sector. For example, they could take very seriously the climate strategies of the city that have been articulated in their climate strategic climate plans. Those would be so expensive that they would actually compromise the economic objectives of the city that are articulated in the so-called city strategy of the Helsinki. So these are the practicalities. To sum up, we've come up from all of the series of experiments. We come up with the following design principles for strategic environmental crisis decisions. First of all, it's a good idea to structure the agenda of this situation room around alternative futures that provoke the imagination of the decision makers and facilitates critical introspection of sort of the normal ways of thinking about the future. And I think it's really critical to be, in these scenarios, to be provocative and challenging to the participants of the situation room exercise. Secondly, You should design the agenda to encourage learning and discourage defensive heuristics that aim to secure a decision maker's personal reputation. This is what Jean-Claude Juncker in the beginning slide was referring to. He was referring to defensive heuristics. In other words, how do I make it in the next elections? And the way to make it is to make short-term decisions. This is probably one of the most challenging design features of any kind of strategic decision platform. The way we are trying to tackle it is by, first of all, having an outside facilitator, not one of the politicians, lead the discussions in the situation room. So it's sort of a neutral or an outside perspective that takes the discussion on. Secondly, we are conducting consecutive exercises, first with the experts to, in a sense, empower their voices, and then make the experts encounter the political decision makers, because normally the politicians overrule what the experts say. And thirdly, I would say it's important to have the physical environment other than the normal decision-making environment of a city administration. Thirdly, it's important to question the formal doctrines by promoting equality between the substance experts, the administrators, and the politicians in the administration. This is democratically sensitive because this is talking about technocracy, or increasing the level of technocratic decision-making in democracies. But I think it's something that we need to sort of face when we discuss the evolution of future democracies. The challenges are such that they are inherently complex and require research-based knowledge. Finally, we've published in a broad range of journals. So you can see ecological economics and ecology and society. They are sort of at the human environmental interaction level. We have safety science, which is really about crisis decisions. We have futures, which is about long-term decisions. And we have sort of policy and governance stuff. So that was my show. Thanks very much.
Thank you a lot, Janne. Very interesting as well, and very concrete. So now we have time for one question. If somebody has something in mind just now, please. Or Tia, did you see anything? Okay, there's somebody with a hand up. Is there? No? So, okay, there's one question by, for example, Heidi Tuhkanen that I see last on the list. So, do you want to speak it out yourself, Heidi?
I hope that you can hear my mic. Yes. So I was wondering whether in the simulations that you had in the project, whether you experienced some mitigation of the trade-offs between the strategic goals, for example, the ones that you mentioned between the economic and disaster mitigation.
What's interesting is that, I mean, we just had it, 1.5 weeks ago, and it's, what's interesting, we had only the experts and administrators of the city, so no politicians. And it's interesting that for administrators, it was really difficult to think in terms of strategic goals. I mean, if I'm really frank, strategies are paper for administrators. So they wanted to talk about their day-to-day decisions and what they have to do daily, their sort of official responsibilities, and they feel that they're struggling with those and don't bother us with the strategic goals. Now, this is interesting. I'm not disappointed. I mean, this stuff has been like a carpenter's work, this series of exercises, carpenter's work that you improve with every version, the new version that you make. So in a sense, I think the message is that we should really look at the day-to-day actions and dig out the decadal implications of those day-to-day actions and not talk about strategies so much. But we'll see what happens. I mean, we will have the next exercise with the politicians in Helsinki, so experts plus politicians. So I suspect that politicians love strategies. So I think we still need to stick to the strategies.
Thank you. It will be interesting to follow.
Thanks.
Yes, and there are many more interesting comments or points made or questions in the chat. But let's do it so that we take more of them up after the last presentation, so that we make sure we don't completely steal the not floor but screen from the next speaker. So the third speaker of today is, and now I'm excited if I'm doing the pronunciation correct, Sabaheta Ramcilovik-Suominen.
That was wonderful.
Who is an associate research professor at the Finnish Natural Resources Institute, SYKE. And the title of Sabaheta's talk today is The What and the How of Transformations. So please, Sabaheta, the screen is all yours.
Thank you. I shared my presentation already. Sorry about that. I just wanted to make sure to save some time. Do you see the full screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. I know my camera is not on, but I don't want to touch anything now that everything cooperates. Let's go on without camera. So yes, thank you for inviting me, and also thanks for the wonderful participation here that we are having today. So I'll talk about transformations today. And in terms of content, I will first provide some background about my research. But the core of the presentations are these 2 points. So first, I will offer different ways of approaching transformations, which position it in contrast or to kind of reformist and inclusionary approaches. And I can say that Minna did a great job already introducing quite a lot of that. And I can see that we have been reading some same literature. And then second, I will present an analytical framework, which is really a work in progress. And I'm planning to use that framework in a forthcoming empirical research on the topic of transformation. So I really appreciate your comments and suggestions afterwards. Now, this slide is something that is a slide that I used in my last presentation on the topic in February. And I decided to reuse it. It is a bit dramatic, but well, the point I want to make here is that there is no need to explain why transformations as a concept, as a practice, as politics, activism, antagonism, or whatever else it can mean to a person, why it is relevant and needed. So I will skip the kind of doom facts, which I think we are all familiar with, from climate change to inequalities, injustices, to sixth extinction, and so on and so forth. But I did write a little about that in this recent paper here, where I also summarize the literature on transformations and often offer an understanding about the concept from a decolonial and also the growth perspective. So if people are interested in that, you're more than welcome to check that out. Okay, so just to kind of position this talk today, we are exploring these issues in the frame of Just Globe project, which stands for Justice and Politics in Global Bioeconomy. And these are the 3 pillars, or the kind of 3 themes in the project. Obviously, they are connected, but sorry, I didn't put the connections in between. The today key focus is on this last pillar, which is transformations. And also, you may notice there is just a small advertisement. There is a link to our special issue on justice and power in bioeconomy, where I think papers are coming, and there are 4 at the moment published, and another 8 to 10 are hopefully coming out at some point in the coming months. So just to highlight that as well. Okay, Now, in terms of approaching transformations, some scholars have made a distinction between transitions and transformations, and other scholars may disagree with this and see this approach as unhelpful. And I realized that when I put this slide or a draft of this slide on Twitter a few days ago. My point here is that, I don't argue that this is a good or bad way to go. I think it is just kind of easier to discuss complex things like transformations, which obviously do not have a single interpretation in terms of what they are not, what they are or so, but it's kind of easier to approach them in contrasting them to something or saying what they actually are not. And I also find this distinction very helpful in analytical terms. So yeah, this is basically this table is entirely based on the literature and my interpretation of this literature. Also, rather than I want to say that rather than seeing it as a kind of either or thing, this can also be understood as a spectrum. So spectrum of different approaches out there. Some scholars would argue, for instance, that their approach to transitions pretty much is kind of same or similar to how I describe transformations here, but indeed, in the literature and generally speaking, I think that transition literature often deals with kind of minor or incremental changes, not always, but yes, it does that sometimes, and it can have a pretty narrow focus or changes in a certain sector or a policy or a country. It's also discussed as a kind of structured and managed process of transitioning within the current ontological and political or institutional structures. It has a kind of goal-oriented way that this is the goal, and then we need these pathways to get there. It is about shifts in structures and practices and technologies. There's a lot of focus on innovations and various, as I said, pathways to get to an ultimate goal. Then on the other spectrum, these transformations is kind of really discussing these larger fundamental shifts, systemic shifts, and out of the shifts out from the ordinary or business as usual. It has a bit larger focus, like planetary focus, planetary justice. It is also uncertain, emerging, heterogenic, also heterodox, and it's not managed and instituted necessarily under the existing structures, but also the existing forms of knowledge and categories and definitions and so on. So it's there is that more focus on onto epistemological shifts, not only the shifts in the practices and structures. But I also want to highlight that in transformations, we have more discussions on social movements, resistance, protests, civil disobedience as a really important triggers of change. But yes, also I think that both of them are emotional and painful and require unlearning. So in a sense, it's something that we must do, but it's nothing to perhaps romanticize about. All right. Now, another way to approach transformations is by positioning them in relation to inclusion. And this is from a paper in review that I co-authored with Tome Valencia Hamilton. There are just 2 points I want to highlight here. So first, that it is not only the outcome or the goal that we should, think about, but also the process or the qualities of a change that matters or should matter when we conceptualize and analyze transformations. And this is often really taking a kind of backseat in the discussions of both transformations and transitions. And second point is the importance of hegemony. So that hegemony is central analytical element for distinguishing between transformations and a kind of simple inclusion. So the key question is what happens to the hegemonic structures and logics in the process and outcome of the change. If hegemony incorporates the new elements, and by that I mean the new, demands and alternative discourses and alternative or marginalized voices and so on, into its pre-existing institutional and logical structures, that is not transformation, but inclusion. I hope that makes sense. It's a bit complicated. So on the contrary, when and if both the existing hegemony and the new elements, so the new entities, actors, logics, and so on, undergo major changes as a result of their encounters, and where that leads to a really something completely new, fundamental change that transcend, and this also word transformation, transcending the pre-existing hegemonic structures and logics, then we are talking about transformation. So as I said, this is just something that we have been experimenting with, and let's see how this idea, how you find it. I would be curious to know. All right, then this has brought me just to think in terms of radical transformations as a kind of counter-hegemonic construct that focuses on underlying or root causes of a problem and seek radical alternatives outside of the hegemonic structures, definitions, binaries, and so on and so forth, which, again, not to repeat myself, but sets transformations apart from reformist approaches and so on. Okay. Finally, let me go through this analytical framework, which I plan to use in a hopefully large empirical study that aims to understand how the different actors that shape the policy and practice, and here I mean local to international, from activism to youth activism, research activists, hopefully also some few cases from indigenous groups in the Amazon. How they, so the local to international, I'm meaning the EU bureaucrats and decision makers, how they perceive of transformations and what does that mean for practice or everything. So I plan to ask them how they position these different dimensions here in relation to transformation and how each of these dimensions should be tackled. What should be the priorities according to whom, and so on and so forth. So to start with this carbon, climate, and the discourse of decarbonization on the top, I put it in yellow. I think I have, I'm aware that it is a narrow focus on carbon, but it's also partly intentional because many do see these things very narrowly. But under this block, I plan to also open up other existential crises. But let's say the example, how to operationalize this element. So, for example, discussing decarbonization, the questions would be to ask to, like, who is decarbonizing whom or what, and how is this planned to happen? Whose historic responsibilities are to be considered? Who is leading the process? Who is likely to sacrifice what, but also whom for decarbonization, and so on and so forth. But for decarbonization and for climate crisis as well. The second point here is the economic growth and degrowth. So basically, how people perceive of these two, or let's say of economic growth and its role in terms of a wider socio-ecological crisis, how they understand the role of growth and degrowth in tackling these crises. Then the justice element, I put it here at the core of transformative change with the different justice dimensions, as you can see them listed here. The idea is to understand then how different groups see justice in relation to transformations. Should it be kind of a priority area or not? Because also Minna had this really interesting slides on seeing just transition as somehow hindering. So anyhow, to kind of understand that, some crucial questions concern making space for other epistemologies or knowledge systems, for instance, indigenous knowledge systems or lived and situated knowledges, but also other ontologies, for instance, relational ontologies, meaning that humans and nature are seen as one and where therefore humans have a moral responsibility, and I stress moral, to nature and to other species and treat it in a reciprocal and a respective way, just as we treat ourselves and our relatives and fellow humans. So these issues of, you can brand them as ecological spirituality, which Western scientists do, others don't, and questions of, wider human-nature relations and the need to re-examine the human-centric worldviews, where human is superior to, and it's above to the rest of the nature and other species. So this is basically the essence of multi-species justice. But I think with this discussion, I also covered the onto-epistemology as a kind of relevant dimension of transformations. Of course, there are other things, but I cannot now go in detail. So this leaves us with the last point, this political dimension of transformations and the questions of political authority, rights, autonomy. And this is mainly concerning the questions related to the process of transformation. So the means, the how, so the character of transformation, whether it's bottom-up versus top-down and so on. Also, what role the different actors and groups could or should play in transformations, and which of these groups are better or worse positioned to de facto really transform the ways we think and we know and we live and so on and so forth. It's a bit, maybe I'm going all the directions now here, but yes, I just want to say that I know that technology should be part of this, but I see it somehow as a relevant aspect, but perhaps less fundamental or less foundational element compared to the rest. It can be an important enabler or disabler of transformations, and that will depend on these other questions. But in any case, I need to think how to incorporate technological change here, and especially if I have businesses and private sector, that this has to be a part of the discussion, but I need to still think it through a little bit. Okay, thank you for your attention, and yes, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sabaheta. Indeed, again, a very interesting presentation. So if there is something immediately in mind for Sabaheta, we still again have a time for 1 or 2 questions before we stop the recording and move on to the more general discussion. So if there's something that you want to immediately bring up for Sabaheta, that is still possible. I see. No, okay, so there is Dalia D'Amato has a hand up. So please, Dalia.
Hello. I just wanted to thank Sabaheta for the presentation. Trying to share my or put my video on, but it's a bit slow. But I just wanted to comment on one of the first slides where you compare basically the transition and the transformation literature. I think that's really interesting, and it's something that I haven't necessarily seen being done explicitly. So maybe there is no need to kind of like go into the details of exactly what the differences would be at like right now, but I found that really interesting, and I think it would be maybe worth pursuing that direction also, like in terms of clarifying those literature bodies and also maybe bringing them together, because they seem to me they seem to be quite separated. I don't think they really communicate, those scholars. Just a comment.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. Just to say that there is one paper that actually, but it's quite old, and I have in that table I have picked up quite some aspects that I have observed. But in the paper from 2016, perhaps, I don't remember, or I cannot pronounce the surname, but there is one scholar that does this kind of contrasting. I can share it with you later or in the chat here.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, and maybe it is time to stop the recording and conclude or close the more official seminar.